Welcome back to another episode of HSF Conversations, the video podcast format for the Hell with Society Forum. I'm Phillip Morgan. I'm a associate editor and senior contributor to the Hell with Society Forum. And today I have with me Dr. Stpehen Beck. Dr. Beck is the chair of the education department at Welch College, where he has served as a faculty member since 2016. Dr. Beck is an ordained minister in the Free Will Baptist denomination. He has served as, prior to coming to Welch College, he served as the administrator of the Free Will Baptist Christian School, which is a pre-K through 12th grade Christian school in St. Croix in the Virgin Islands. And so he served in that capacity for 9 years while serving as an associate missionary for North American Ministries. During that time, he also taught mathematics at the University of the Virgin Islands. Prior to his work in that capacity, he worked in the aerospace industry in Huntsville area and served in a local church in that same community. Dr. Beck is a father of five, like myself. We have that in common. He's a father of five, and he's also served as the legal guardian for 4 international high school students in the United States. His father was a pastor, and his maternal grandfather was the first president at Welch College, Dr. L.C. Johnson. So I've invited Dr. Beck to join me today to have a conversation about the various issues that parents face when we're trying to decide how to educate our children. Christian parents who are concerned about raising their children well oftentimes get into conversations with me about how we think about what kind of schooling we're going to provide for our children. Should we send them to public school? Should we send them to a private Christian school? Should we consider homeschool? And so I wanted to ask Dr. Beck in because he has experience in all of those backgrounds. He was raised in a pastor's home, and he's attended public schools and private schools. His children have attended both public and private, and they've even, 4 of them even had a little while as homeschool. And in my experience, I was homeschooled for most of my childhood. I spent a little time in a Christian school at the end of my 12 years. And then my children are homeschooled. And so we wanted to just kind of talk through, not so much who's the best, got the best plan and make a case. But instead what we wanted to do was to talk about the various challenges and benefits that come from each of these approaches, and what are the major decisions that we need to talk through. And so I'm very glad to have Dr. Beck with us today and to bring his expertise as well as his experience to bear on that. So I'm glad you're with us. I'd like to just kind of open this up with a broad question, which is, what are the major topics or questions, concerns that parents need to ask of themselves before deciding on what approach to take to educating their children?
I start off really broad, and it's probably like one of the worst answers you can give somebody, but it may get them thinking. I've had parents ask me that, and I said, well, why don't you, we're talking about elementary school children, why don't you just have them go work in a factory? Now, that's not the right solution, but at the same time, prompting parents to think about, why do I want my child to be educated? That's extremely important, even more so from a Christian perspective of, okay, my child is going to school. Is he just going to school? Is she just going to school so they can get a good job when they're done? And if that's the case, then hey, maybe they should, drop out in 6th grade, like my grandfather did on my father's side. Dropped out in 6th grade, went to war. And nothing wrong with that, particularly in the context, but I think a real important starting point is your child is going to get an education. What are you looking for? Why do you want to do it? It's not something you go into blindly and say, well, I think I want them to get an education because they're getting on my nerves. I want them out of the house. They're old enough. I don't want the neighbors to talk about me. I don't want human services to come. Most parents wouldn't say that as, why they want their child to get an education. But we have to be intentional about, what is it that we're looking for when Our kindergartner is going off to school. Why do I want them to go off to school? Why do I want to homeschool them? Why do I want a private school? Why do I want a public school? So being very intentional, and I think you alluded to this. One of the biggest things that I found as a help is sitting down and talking to other like-minded Christians and saying, what problems am I going to have with this? What opportunities and advantages am I going to have with this? There are things that doesn't even occur to you, based on age and geography and places that people who are also like-minded believers can kind of have been around the corner, can give feedback on. So being very intentional would be the first thing. And the second really important thing would be getting that feedback from other Christian believers who have children who are praying about the same decisions. Getting that information becomes hugely important. It's not just something that just happens as a rite of passage, that we're very intentional about how we approach education and the education of our children.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that you brought up there is a thing that I've noticed oftentimes in these conversations is I kind of get the sense sometimes, not all the parents, but sometimes they're trying to ask, what is the easiest but most responsible solution? And which I understand completely, because we're all, very busy and we have lots of things, but we also want to be responsible. And I think that for me, whenever I'm discussing, what I come back to again and again is there's no easy answer to this question. It's always very contextually based on, what is your design? What is your desire for you and your spouse together? You can't be a one person only solution. You have to be working on this together. And then once you have made that decision, that's not the end of the conversation even. It is an ongoing process. And I like that you brought up the idea of talking to other Christians who are, of like mind and who are mature in your area. And I also find it helpful to talk to older Christians who have kids that are a little bit older than mine. We were talking the other day, we both have 5 kids, but yours are a little older than mine. Yours are starting to work their way out of high school, and mine are working their way through elementary right now. So just getting the perspective of an older Christian who has more experience, I think that is super beneficial. And I think that can help, especially when you're thinking of maybe what private Christian school options are even available in the area. Not every Christian school is going to be beneficial for your child. There's, all schools have strengths and weaknesses. So, what are some of the other kind of maybe more logistical questions that you think are helpful for parents to think through as they're trying to make this decision, just on a technical level? And I can give you kind of one that is particularly important, I think, when young people are asking me about this is, I always tell them up front, if they're asking about homeschooling, usually when they're asking me, because that's my background and that's what we do with our children. And I always tell them, both of you have to be committed to this. It can't be one of you only. And my wife and I have known families where the mom was really committed to it, or the dad was, and the other wasn't. And that just it's a recipe for lots of frustration. And it's really not beneficial for anybody in those circumstances often. So it really has to be a logistical thing of, have you really talked through this with your prospective spouse or your spouse? And is this something you really want to do? And I think that applies to the other 2 options, public school and private school as well.
Yeah, and I think being on the same page is huge. If you're doing it right, whether that's homeschool or public school or private school, it's going to be hard. So there's not going to be the easy button when it comes to educating your children. And again, each are going to have different challenges, but don't go into the approach of, I'm going to put my kids in public school and hey, everything's just taken care of and that's going to be the easy option. I mean, that's not going to be the case. You're going to be dealing with a set of challenges for, if you're a concerned parent about your child's education, that you're going to have a bunch of extra work finding out, okay, what did they assign to read? And now I've got to read it. And then I'm looking at the bios and to see, what is this teacher teaching? What are the other students saying? So it's not, you're going to have to be on the same page with your spouse. That's a huge thing, as well as knowing that it's going to be a time commitment if you're conscientious about it. And if you're doing it right, it's going to be hard. It's going to take a lot of time and a lot of effort. And I would say, tied in directly to that is it doesn't matter what program your children in. My children, when they started off, my 4 oldest started off being homeschooled, and then they were in a Becca for curriculum. Know your child's curriculum. And I have great things to say about a Becca and Bob Jones curriculum as well. But like, know their strengths, know their weaknesses. Don't say, oh, it's a Becca, it's a great Christian education, it's classical in its approach to English and phonics. And then those know its strengths, but also know, okay, if this is what we're using, what is it that I need to supplement with critical thinking or additional reading? And that's going to be true in public school. Know the curriculum that you're using it, know why your school district has chosen the curriculum that they've chosen. I'm not so much for standing up and screaming at a board meeting, but I'll go to the board meetings in Sumner County where my children go to school, and listen to see what is it that people are saying. Why is it that they're changing math curricula in the school that we're in? So I, as a parent, knowing that curriculum becomes a very, very practical part, no matter where you are, and knowing, what do I supplement with? What do I go, okay, if I'm in charge of this, what do we change and get rid of? So the curricular aspect of it becomes something that's hugely important. And then having both spouses in on that to look at it from multiple perspectives, because just because I think something is boring or lousy or useless to read, and my wife might have a much better, usually does, and insightful opinion to go, no, that one's really good because of such and such. I'm like, okay. So that's where the strength of that relationship and marriage comes into play, when you're both looking at the curriculum, you're both stalking the teacher, so to speak, if you're in certain contexts.
Yeah, I think about that curriculum issue. In my experience as a child growing up, it was interesting. So both my parents had taught at the Christian school in our area prior to me being born, and my dad, for a while I was a child, he sold Saxon math books at homeschool book fairs. So I learned about why he believed that Saxon math textbooks were superior to other curriculum. And I started, but there was a low-level curriculum discussion going on in our home as we were going through those things. And I have really appreciated that ever since, because it was assuming, one, that your kids shouldn't be involved in those conversations either. Like that's a bad assumption to do that. They were welcoming us into those conversations and talking through that. And I think that helps if we go into that mentality, no matter what schooling system we use. I think that helps us to be very intentional about the information that our children are learning, and from what perspective it's coming from, and then helping to provide other perspectives. So even with our kids, as they get older, you want to do this more than in elementary, but even though we're trying to present them with the interpretation we think is best, or the approach that we think is best, we also want them to be aware that there are other understandings of these issues. And I think that that's an important aspect of it, no matter which curriculum is being used, as well as to help balance it out. So I think that's a very helpful thing. And then another thing that kind of comes along with, we've been talking about the time commitment and kind of the relational part, but it's also a financial decision that people really need to sit down with a budget and think through. Public school, your taxes go to that, and it's at least ostensibly free. It's not how it actually plays out, as I have often heard, but that's at least ostensibly the case. And then if you decide you're going to send your child to a private school, there's the added cost that's going to go with that. And if you're going to do homeschooling, well, then at least one parent has to stay home. So that means you're going to be living on a one income family. And so, when somebody's interested in talking about homeschooling, I just always tell them, you want to be very sure that you have made the financial calculations that are going to come with that. And I think it's workable for more people than people realize, but it also means that your standard of living is probably not going to look like what everyone else in your friend group does. And so, and I think that goes for the private school as well. That's a huge financial sacrifice. And this is a whole nother issue, but in a lot of states, your tax dollars are still going to fund the public school. and then you're paying for the education of your children on top of that. So you're paying for it twice. That can be very frustrating. So, but anyway, that's another aspect of it.
And that factor of, are you multiplying that tuition by times 3 or times 4 or times 5? If you're adopting children, are you multiplying it times 6 or times 7? So, that figuring out those time calculations, if you're doing homeschool along with cost calculations, that becomes, a little bit of different math when you have more children.
Yes.
And then just one of those things down the road, you'll get to know and love this in the future is, okay, when they start going multiple directions at the same time. So, one's going to cross country and one's going to, CTS trumpet practice, and, and you're involved in these things, and even these things that are very integrated into your church, and you're, in public school or private school or homeschool, and then they're big and going different directions, how you still maintain all of that and keep the pantry stocked.
Yeah. We're just now starting to work into that particular problem. No, that's absolutely true. And I think that's the other, that has always been kind of my concern. Sometimes people kind of get a utopian vision of any of those three. And they say, if I just take this one, then that's going to be a laid back, easier version. And I always want to caution them and say, listen, there's lots of calculations we need to be doing going into it, so that at least, there's always things we can't account for, things we won't know until you're in the middle of it. But it's better if you've thought through some of those things in advance. So kind of maybe getting a little more specific, I wondered if maybe we could just talk through for a few minutes the strengths and the weaknesses we see in each of these options for parents. What are the strengths we see? And let's go through and just say, what are the strengths we see in public, private, and homeschooling? And then we'll come back and maybe address the weaknesses we find there as well.
And I'll just start off at home with us. I was a principal of a Christian school. I had 4 children at home, eventually 5 children at home. And my first 4, my wife was homeschooling them, even though I was a principal at a Christian school. And we lived on campus. There's a sense that's kind of awkward. But that was, for my wife and I and our children, that was what they needed. There were some specific things that they individually needed. And so that was how they started off. And then ended up going to a Christian school, and going to a Christian school up through, for our oldest, up through 6th grade. And I'd say, one of the challenges in a Christian school, that as a parent who's trying to be conscientious, when you have an elementary school student at a Christian school, their perception is, everybody at my school is Christian, and this is what Christians do. And that's an erroneous assumption. And you can sit down and have that conversation with your 1st grader or 2nd grader, but what their classmate who goes to a Christian school says on the playground is what Christians say, and that's what Christians do. And in an elementary context, it's humorous because you address it and you're like, no, well, Christians don't do that and Christians don't say that, and it's almost humorous. But then when they start getting into, to middle school and then even to high school, you maybe aren't having that same conversation, but that is a concern that's still in the back of your mind, because everybody at a Christian school is not going to be Christian, and if they are, they're not all living like it. That in the back of your child's mind, even if, like in an elementary school, they're not coming out and saying it, they're going, okay, this is what it's like, especially in a Christian school context. And so when I was in middle school, the Christian school I went to, very rough schools, ended up going to public school that was really rough, but you knew you were, and I hate to say it this way, you knew you were better because you weren't selling drugs, there wasn't this violence in your school. So you knew you were better at your Christian school. And I'm not dismissing the fact that it's good to be at a school where there's not drugs and violence, don't misunderstand. But that's not what's making you in a relationship with God. That's not what's necessarily advancing in your education. So I'd say one of the biggest, cautions in a Christian school context would be, okay, having my children in that context know that, being in a Christian context is not making you more Christian. It might be avoiding certain worldly things that we definitely want to avoid. Like, I want my children to avoid drugs. That's completely right up there. But at the same time, that you don't have the person sitting next to you in class dealing drugs isn't making you closer to God. And so that challenge it's both a very big pro in a private Christian school, but it's also something as a parent that I'm looking at to say, I want to speak into the specific situation so that that this intentional bubble that's around you, that we all put around our children and want there, that's not moving you in your relationship with God. Ideally, it's not moving you away from it, but just because you don't experience those things doesn't mean that that's a indication of a healthy walk with Christ.
Yeah, no. So my experience in spending a year and a half in private school and having a lot of friends that were in private schools as well was that there is a temptation to start to feel like you're in a safe place. And so you've spoken to the relational, the social element with fellow students, which is a concern. You don't want your kids hanging out with bad friends. And I do think the odds of them having those bad friends are slightly less at a private school, but they're not none. It's not zero. And they can certainly find bad friends if they want to. And the other element of it is that it can create a false sense of safety in the content. I think when we as parents send our kids to public schools, we're going to be, if we're intentional, we're telling them, listen, don't believe everything your teacher tells you. That teacher does not necessarily represent a Christian worldview, and they may not even represent kind of the way we understand the world politically or any of those other things. And so we're a lot more intentional about putting them on guard. And we don't do that as much as a Christian school because we do trust them. And it's part of the reason, and the content we hope is a good deal better. But there's that other element where you still have to kind of try to say, okay, now I think your teacher is a Christian, as far as I can tell, and I think they're probably going to be telling you good stuff, but also just be aware, don't just buy anything that you're told immediately. And let's think through and talk through these things, because Christians come to different positions on these things. We have disagreements about that, even when we're all acting in our most sanctified manner, let alone when we're not. So I think that's true. And I think that it also applies to homeschooling because, I think if you're going to do that well, you also then have kind of homeschool gathering groups that we were part of, that we were interacting with and on a weekly basis. And in our homeschool group, there are people who are pretty clearly not Christians. And then there are some who claim Christianity, but don't act like it. And so you have all those elements that are present. And so we found that we're navigating some of those same conversations with our children, just to say, well, and you're not trying to, what would you call it? Denigrate anyone, but you're wanting to tell your child, well, that person might not be a good friend to make, or be careful, this person's saying this thing, this person who's a leader or a teacher, doesn't necessarily mean that that's accurate. And so that doesn't disappear with homeschooling. I do think that maybe what we find is that the balance of caution and encouragement kind of shifts in each of those three places. So and this is just my perspective, and I'd like to see if you think this is, in the public school setting, there's a much more kind of strong emphasis on be very careful, be very watchful, and really come at it with a very strong hermeneutic of suspicion of what's going on, and really kind of emphasizing the defensive aspect. In the private school, there is less of that, and there's a little bit more of encouraging, especially pay attention to this teacher. I know this teacher. I go to church with this person, or and I think they really are going to give you good information, good stuff that'll be beneficial to you spiritually and intellectually. And these will be good friends, and there's a little bit more of a relaxed element, but there's still that balance there. And at least for me, it seems that in homeschool, because so much of the education is coming from the parents, that's not such a big conversation at that point. And it is more so about kind of developing the defensive kind of not building bad friends. And, it just seems that you're not emphasizing that defensive element as much now. And that's just my perception. So if you have a different view on that, I'd like to hear that. So.
I think that's correct. And, I think even content wise, your child will come home and have learned how to do addition a certain way from a Christian teacher. And it's not the wrong answer, but it's just like that's not the best way to do it. It's hard to tell your elementary school student, no, that godly lady, she didn't teach you the best way to do addition. That's different. And, with you're talking about having your guard up, it's a little easier to do because we do have that, critiquing when it's at a public school where, basically it's like, all right, debrief me at the end of the day, like what went on,
Yeah.
and I'm like, okay, that view of what she taught, totally wrong. Like we're having that conversation more, still as a parent, and then, again, husband and wife, looking at this and going, I mean, and here's one of the things that I would say it applies to homeschool as well, to where the way that I want to teach my children, I'll just say math. I did the math, my wife would do the English. That worked very well in our household. But the way that I think you should learn math, and the way my children learn math from me, might not actually be, the best, say all end all for everything. That's hard for me as a math teacher and a father. If I'm like, man, that teacher actually, knew what she was doing better than I did.
Sure.
I mean, I wouldn't be ashamed to admit it, but at the same time, particularly in a public school context, I don't want to have such a buffer that it's, that we're just still not learning anything. And so,
Right.
One of the challenges when we do prepare our children to be in a context where there's adversarial information is there's information that it's just, well, you know what, we've never done it that way, but that works. And it's not undercutting any core beliefs. And it's not the way I want them to learn, but at the same time, it is consistent, it reflects truth. And so the caution to having that buffer up, particularly in a public context, would be, be willing to learn. And in a homeschool context, be willing to go, you know what, that's not the methodology or the approach that's best for my child. And even though I learned it that way, maybe there's a better way than the way I wanted to teach it. And again, that's where having a wife who thinks differently and comes to the table with other skills, that's where that comes in. You're like, well, okay, that's a much better way to approach this. You're explaining math to your daughter, and your sons get it, and your daughter's just looking at you with tears in her eyes, and then your wife comes and tells her how to do it, and she gets it the first time. You can learn as a parent, as a homeschool, you can learn a lot from that as a teacher. And so being able to do that in all of those contexts, I think, is really important curricularly and then socially as well.
Yeah. And so I think, that's another kind of range of spectrum of kind of things that we can do, which is to the ability to contextualize what you're doing and the methodology for the students' learning abilities and their strengths and their weaknesses. I think that that's one of the strengths that homeschooling really brings in. That's one of the reasons we have really liked it is, in a classroom where you have lots of students, that's at the college level as well as at any level. The bigger the class is, the less flexibility you have. And so I see that same scale on the public, private to homeschool, which is at the public school level, there's just less opportunity for, individual instruction giving, and highlighting. Maybe your child has real struggles with the subject and they need some extra attention, extra time. They'll get some of that. And I'm not saying the teacher's doing a bad job. I'm not even, assuming they're doing everything to the best of their ability. Logistically, that's just, it's a challenge. But also if your student's really excelling and they could really, stretch their legs and get more, and they just can't because of the classroom size that plays into it. And so I do think that that's also another factor in there, is that you have these kind of this kind of sliding scale of how you can individualize the instruction. Now the other kind of element is the social element. And I know as a homeschooler, we get tired, honestly, oftentimes of people coming and be like, well, but your kid's not going to be socialized. And I go, yeah, well, we're not just holed up back in the woods completely. We get out and about. But I think that is a fair thing to address, that the idea of being aware of what the culture is like around you and your generation, and having some common experiences with people of your generation, that you have that common touch point as you go forward. And kind of working from the public school to the homeschool end again, I think that in the public school setting, one of the real benefits is your children get exposed to people from very different backgrounds, from very different some degree socioeconomic backgrounds, but also cultural backgrounds. And there's a real benefit to mixing and mingling with people from very different perspectives and having that kind of geographical connection to your community. I was homeschooled, and a lot of people in my church and in my county, they all went to the same high schools. And so they always have the touch point when they meet somebody roughly their same age. They're like, oh, which school where did you go to? And then and I don't really have that talking point with them. I don't have that geographical connection. I've had to build it in other ways. So that's one of the real strengths that comes with public school education. And then the private school education, we've already noted that in some ways your odds are better of having a better friend group, but they're not 100%. So you're fighting the danger of, preparing your kids to be, perceptive and say, okay, just because this person claims a Christian, are they behaving in this way? Are they acting this way? And you still get some of that socialization that's there. On the homeschool end, I think that it is very important for us to be intentional about, my parents were this way with me, and we've tried to be this way with our kids, is make sure that we're involving them in various activities where they're spending time with kids their own age, either through church or through a homeschool group or through other community activities. And on the other end, and this is kind of my cousin, this is his thought on it. He's the benefit of the socialization on the homeschool end, on the other hand, is the modern kind of education system is a development of the Industrial Revolution as well. As prior to that, pretty much every child spent their entire childhood with their family, and it was extended family, but it was with their family and a lot of time with their parents. And so, for the homeschool response, there was the emphasis of, but it also gives us more time on parent to child relationship and more time of that cultivating and raising of a child. And so, and I know that, just friends of mine that have had kids in school, especially or either public or private, that's also, you have to be very intentional in the afternoon when you get home to build in those family times. And I know for me, I work all day and I get home and I'm exhausted. So I know, everybody else is, and it's just, so I think we're trying to figure out, what is the balance that you want to try to find for your family in that regard. And you've had some experience with that as well. What do you think about the socialization element for children in those contexts?
Yeah, in fact, in my wife's case, my wife's family were missionaries in Mexico. They were in a village with no electricity. So when you're talking about, hey, we're not out in the middle of nowhere, she was homeschooled and she was out in the middle of nowhere. They didn't have running water or electricity, and she graduated from a homeschool. This is again before the internet. If no electricity, internet's not going to matter anyway. But where they would have to drive, I think 6 hours to go mail her homeschool work off. So when you're talking about being isolated, that's the context that my wife and her siblings grew up in, and her parents were very intentional about their socialization. Now they had diversity in the sense of they're in the mountains of Mexico. They've got that diversity from that standpoint. But they're intentionally coming back across the border when they're going on deputation. They're talking about their ministry, but their parents are intentionally putting them in social contexts so they know what's going on in the United States. They learn how baseball works. Those sorts of things were very intentionally done by her family. And then for us, the U.S. Virgin Islands is the United States, but it's also it's very different. We drive on the left-hand side of the road, and I could go down some of the differences. But as a parent, you're conscious of, okay, this is what's happening in the context that we're in, and I want to kind of get my children up to speed to know, okay, everybody else is not going to come talk to school and talk about cricket. They're just not, okay. And I realize your friends in St. Croix are, but if you bring it up, they're going to think that's odd. And so being intentional about that, and I think a good resource on that, especially in any denomination, but is missionary kids, because their parents are. And it's not the same thing as homeschool. And even if they're going to a public school or to an international school, they're still sort of out of their culture and out of those common cultural touch points that you made reference to. Back when I was young and our family didn't go to movies, a movie would come out and like everybody's talking about it. And you sort of feel like, well, Return of the Jedi came out and I can't even talk about it. And it's nothing, it doesn't come on television. Like I'm never going to be a part of this conversation. and I never was. And I guess that's okay. But at the same time, knowing those things that if you're homeschooling, that, okay, here is what society is focused on. And maybe some of those you opt and go, well, you know what? It's great that you don't know anything about that.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And you go, there's a green check mark. And then there are other things to where, things are going on in the world, or things are going on in sports or social, and you want to read your children into that. You want to expose them to things so they're able to interact with those people. So missionary kids are a great resource for that, because that's something that parents, coming home for deputation, they're very conscious of. When you come back and you don't know where the Rio Grande is, you don't know Canada is north of the United States. Those are things as a parent that you're really, now, okay, kids, we're going to sit down and look at a map. When we moved back to the States, I put maps on my kids' walls, because I wanted them to see it. When they talked about the West in the Virgin Islands, they're talking about the West end of the island. They're not talking about California or anywhere. It wasn't going to be the end of my kids' world, but at the same time, I know that that's going to be something different. So I'm intentional about doing that. And that's a commonality that, would exist in homeschool, and being intentional about incorporating the things that they don't know, but they need to know, into what they're learning.
Yeah. Well, so as we're kind of bringing our conversation to a close, I want to address maybe two practical questions. And one of these, and we had a conversation about this in the past, and I thought this was so smart. And so I would love for you to kind of expand on this maybe a little bit more, and maybe other things that you've come across that you thought were really good practical ways to help your kids succeed in whatever they're doing. But you and I had talked once before, and if I remember correctly, you'd said that you had intentionally held maybe a kid back and made sure that they went in later, so that they ended up being the oldest kid in their group, because that was just kind of a natural barrier. It helped their chances of not being drawn into a crowd or being bullied, and it made them the older person in the group. So I wonder if you have other kind of life hacks, as it were, like that, where I thought that was just a really great, practical, smart way of just helping your kid out in a little way.
And the specific context of that, when we moved to the Virgin Islands back to the United States, we looked at Christian school options. We looked at homeschool options. We decided to put our children in public school. Very intentional and prayed over decision. And so for my 4 older children, we all held them back a grade. And as you mentioned, they're going to be older. I read some articles, because I was looking through academic research about parents who do that for, they call it red shirting, so they can be better at sports. And that was totally not on our radar. But apparently that's a thing where parents want their kid to be bigger and stronger at sports, so they hold them back a year before they go to high school. That was not our intention, but it did give them a context to be the older one in the group, as you're saying. So, how are they going to adapt to peer pressure? How are they going to adapt to a different culture? This gave them some time, a buffer, to make that adaptation socially as well as academically, because academics were going to be different. So, that was one of the things that was a very practical thing. Another thing that we do is, without going into a great depth about my opinion of standardized testing, regardless of what we think about it, standardized testing is the litmus test that's going to determine whether you go to college with a scholarship or you get into graduate school. And we can talk about how that may or may not be a great representation of knowledge. Like, I have twins, and I can tell you, boy, girl are twins, and I know how much they know, and then I watch them take a test and watch the differences in the standardized scores. So, we can say we can question validity, but at the same time, I'm sitting down with the tests that they're going to have, not the actual tests, but the type of tests. So we're doing practice ACTs, we're doing practice SATs, because that's one of the things that academically our culture looks at and says, this is the de facto measurement of knowledge. It's not, but if our culture says this is going to be what determines whether you get into a college or not, I want you to be prepared for that. So we're sitting down, and we're that dorky family that Christmas break, all the kids do practice ACTs. And somebody's going to call human services on me, because we do that. And then it's gotten to the point where they're like, are we doing ACT practice over, Christmas break? And then they're wanting more of it. So that's maybe a bad thing. I don't know.
No, I think that's good.
So, I mean, it's,
my experience, I was the oldest of 5. And so my parents, that I was the first one to go through that. And I noticed that between myself and my youngest sibling, who was 13 years younger than me, they found other ways to incentivize that test prep because just the you really need to do this didn't, I had a hard time biting on that one. I had to, you need some more incentive. And so I think that if you can make it familial experience as well, that helps. And I do think that's right. There's logistical things that go on in being a part of our society and culture. And one of the benefits of going to a school is a child becomes accustomed. I don't Again, we're not arguing whether the merits of this is actually a good thing for human beings, but you become accustomed to sitting still in a desk for a set number of hours and paying attention to an instructor at the begin, the front of the room, in a way that you don't get in homeschool. Now, I do know some homeschool families that have tried to mimic that, but it still doesn't quite have the same feel, and that may cultivate all sorts of other frictions in the home. But anyway, but there is a real benefit to that, and I know from my experience and from anecdotal evidence that homeschoolers, we tend to struggle when we get to college, figuring out the schedule and making sure we get everything in on time and all those things. That just is a logistical problem. So ways that we can mitigate that along the way, I think, are helpful. And I think doing those kind of standardized tests is good. And for our family, we use church especially to really try to instruct our children: sit still with your hands either in your lap or taking notes, and you want to focus very closely on the minister. And of course, we want to do that anyway, but for us, it has another purpose, which is trying to teach our children how to sit up, pay attention, take notes, and do those kinds of things in a very intentional way. Go ahead.
Let me just throw in one other thing really quick too that you kind of referenced, but that is very much integrated into education. And that's the local church, and that's in our case CTS competitions. That's Bible memorization and Bible Bowl and Truth Quest. I mean, it's a vehicle through which you can demonstrate and learn academically, but it's also in your local church. And so to me, that's a win-win to be able to be involved in the local church, be memorizing scripture, be interacting with peers at other churches. To me, that brings the best, both worlds together and reinforces what you're doing in education in a local church context. And the same thing in Sunday school is to where, we're prompting, if we're looking at, I don't know, diagramming sentences, God forbid, like, okay, what if you're looking at, your Sunday school curriculum, we're finding the preposition and the, in the handbook. I mean, that's a dorky thing to say as well, but, like, we're trying to make sure that what's happening academically isn't just this thing over here that happens at school, and then we go to church over here and the two never meet. It's like, no, this is how that thing that you read, that book that you read, here is how this is relating to curriculum in Sunday school. I remember our family having this conversation about Les Mis and redemption, and and having that as something that one of my children brought up when we were looking at our Randall House literature. And it's like, that's great to see that you've taken this book that you read and tied it into what we're going to be studying at Sunday school this Sunday. And so integrating those becomes a huge aspect to support all three of these different approaches to education.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And that was actually where I wanted to end on was, we are both ordained and we've been engaged in ministry at the local church level. I want to know if there's some practical things that we can give recommendations to pastors who, regardless of whatever their position is on schooling, they're leading a congregation that is going to have families who take various different approaches to this. What are some practical steps that we can say from our own experience that are just, ways that we can be good ministers to people in our congregations, regardless of what they're doing? How can we support and provide them with good counsel in that process?
I mean, I think first, knowing what type of school your congregants are going to, knowing why they chose the route that they went. If you can get to the next level and peel back a little bit of the curriculum in the sense of, if you know that in 5th grade they're going to read this book, or in 7th grade they're going to read The Most Dangerous Game or whatever, like if you know those specific things that are happening, then you're putting it into a sermon illustration. I had a pastor, Dr. Harrison, loved him being able to incorporate literature and so many different things into what he was learning. And, he would ask me, what are you reading in college? And, so he knew what I was reading. He was recommending things. And so, being a place where, okay, it's summertime, if you're a pastor, be that resource that's saying, hey, have you thought about reading such and such? And, the sermon next week is going to be on the plan of redemption, and, being intentional about the things that that they're learning and how that's going to tie into Sunday school curriculum or the sermon. Those are things that you don't think about, but at the same time, it's going to cue in and tie into the education that a child is getting. And then, by extension, support the family that is doing that. So it doesn't just seem like, oh, that's what Phillip Morgan does. And your kids think, oh, that's just what mom and dad do. Now there are other people that are doing that. And then, lo and behold, you have teenagers having this conversation because they're both in the same sermon and having the same content, and then that begins to reinforce. So being able to tie that together, I think, is a big thing.
Yeah, I love that personal aspect of it that you're bringing in, which is, being a careful and attentive minister to each family and being aware of why they're doing that and helping them think through that. Oftentimes, parents aren't necessarily thinking through it, and just helping them work through that decision in a thoughtful manner. And I think also, again, regardless of what your position is, to also be loving toward the family that's taking whatever position you are. And at least in my experience, there has been sometimes there's been a temptation to really downplay public school system, public education, and to the point where it feels a little bit aggressive, and to feel like it puts families on the defensive if that's their decision they've made. And so I think building those personal relationships, even if you want to, encourage a particular family in your church to consider another form, you should only do it in that kind of loving relationship where there's a clear sense of trust and acceptance that isn't going to be, judgmental. And then for the instruction part of it, I think it's so beneficial to hear sermons that deal with Christian worldview thinking, and how do we think through subject matters from a Christian worldview, and why, what do we think about the value of education? What is its purpose? Is it simply for job training, or is it for something else? And is it about the development of the human being? And how does that link in with our belief in sanctification and, the development of yourself as a Christian? And so I find that, that kind of instruction that's going to be more principle based can then be applied in specific circumstances by families. And I think it's always good also to just kind of give some help in trying to think through the application process of how do you apply the principle of, going to the lost and bringing the gospel to them. How do we apply that in those circumstances? Does sending our kids to public school provide them with more opportunities to learn how to evangelize? And does that mean that homeschooling is therefore, anti-missions? We want to think through those things, and how do we apply that principle of sharing the gospel with the lost in each of those circumstances? So I think that if we're doing that on a private consulting basis and giving, good biblical instruction, I think that's a good support system for our families, no matter what their decisions are and what their decisions they're making. Well, I think we've covered most of what I was hoping we could, and I appreciate so much your perspective on this and a lot of the counsel you have to give. Is there anything that, kind of in closing, that you wanted to add before we go?
No, I appreciate the opportunity, and again, it's good when you have those supportive churches that are very much want to be a part of the education of your children, and you have, and in my experience growing up, and then hopefully for my children, in the context that they're in, church and school are not at conflict with each other. They're working together, and that becomes what you want to have happening. So you don't have children choosing between one or the other. It is one is the extension of the other. If you're going to school, it's an extension of what you're doing in your local church, and so having that approach in large part comes from that supportive environment, certainly the pastor, but then even by extension, other people in the church. I mean, I chose to originally become an electrical engineer because a deacon in the church was an electrical engineer, and I had to pick which type of engineer I wanted to be. So having those other people in the church who are a part of that and who are saying, hey, I'll help you with your calculus homework, or, like that, again, that local church tie-in becomes huge to broadening education and making it have more of a foundation with other believers that you're worshiping with.
Yeah, I think that's great. Well, that's great. Well, thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Beck. And thank you for viewing this video, and join us again next time for our episode of HSF Conversations.